Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this edition of Naturalist 101. My name is Stephanie. I am the education coordinator here at 100 Miles. And tonight we're going to do a naturalist guide of Cumberland Island. So I'm a naturalist. We're going to do a little bit of history from my point of view as being someone who has been teaching out on Cumberland for close to 15 years. And then we'll also talk a little bit of the nature the flora and the fauna that is out there. Feel free to ask questions. Those of you who are online, thank you for joining us. Feel free to write your questions in the comments and they'll be asked and when it's time. So all of those will happen. So let's get going. See if there we go. For those of you who are joining us online or don't know, 100 Miles, our mission is to preserve and protect the 100 miles of the Georgia coast through education, hence tonight, citizen engagement, and also through advocacy. So if you are not familiar with who and what we stand for. So we're going to talk about Cumberland, but you can't talk about Cumberland without talking about all of the barrier islands on the Georgia coast. Barrier islands is a simple term, meaning it is an island that is standing in front of the mainland and protects it from storm events, hurricanes, tropical storms. So it's a line of defense. So barrier islands, or this line we have here, these are the major ones here in Georgia, are not permanent structures. They're meant to move around. And they're constantly being reshaped, reformed by winds, storms, waves, lots of forces. So currently we are where that little dot, we're in that little dot area of Brunswick. And Cumberland is our southernmost barrier island in Georgia, so which is right here. And so right below it is the Florida line. So if you have visited there and taken the Cumberland ferry over to the island, you actually go into Florida waters before you get to Cumberland, which is always fun to say. So it is the furthest south. It is also the largest barrier island in Georgia. It is roughly the size of Manhattan in New York. So when you think about islands, how many people are living on that island versus how many people are living on Cumberland Island. It's also the longest stretch of undeveloped beach, too, on our coastline. So the island is 17.5 miles long. Because the beach is a little wavier and because it connects with Little Cumberland Island, it's more like 20 miles of beach, I think. Yes, so this is a satellite image of Cumberland Island. So yes, so here's Amelia Island, Florida. Most people who visit the island take the ferry and you end up here on the southern end of the island. And then up here, there's a little Christmas Creek and that separates Little Cumberland from the mainland. But from a satellite image, it's really hard to see that as two separate islands. So Cumberland Island is part of our national park system. It is a national seashore, so it's a little bit different designation, but it's still under the NPS. So that area does incorporate Little Cumberland, even though that is private property lands up there. National seashore, but not all of the land is public. There are still private landowners on the island as well. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forwards. This is the park map. It's harder to see from a distance, but it shows you all of the uses that are there. So you can go for day trips, but there are also multiple campsites on the island that you can make reservations for. Since it is a national park, it does limit the number of visitors that can go there. On average, a year, there are 60,000 visitors to Cumberland, but on a daily basis, it's capped at 300. But that is the national park visitors. So there are some private property. Those people aren't counted in that number. So you can, and the docks that you, on a typical day, will drop you off either at Dungeness or Sea Camp, and they're less than a mile away from each other. So this is the area that most people visit on a daily trip, because to head up anywhere else, you would need to be camping or staying overnight. There is one private bed and breakfast on the island, and it's not on this map, which is probably for a reason. It's right around here, and that is Grayfield Inn. So if you are lucky enough to stay there, it's a bed and breakfast, lunch and dinner. All your meals are provided, and there's obviously activities. And their ferry actually leaves from Amelia Island to go over to the island because it is closer than St. Mary's. So we're going to go back in time. The first human evidence on Cumberland was 4,000 years ago with indigenous tribes that we don't even know the name because there's no written language or anything that's come from there. The tribes that are talked about the more recently are the ones that we have named because we don't actually know what they were called, or the Timucuan or the Timucuan, depending on if you grew up in Florida or Georgia. And that was not even what they called themselves, but they were all over northern Florida and southern Georgia. Not so much here on St. Simon's, but just a little further south on Cumberland, they were there. They used Cumberland for obviously the abundant resources. They did move around. However, there were more established villages because of the size of Cumberland and the freshwater resources on Cumberland that not all of our barrier islands have. So there were much more permanent residents of the Timucuan or Timucuan on there. These are, of course, European depictions of those of that indigenous peoples that were there. Later on, most of the Timucuan or Timucuan were killed off by diseases. And so later on, when the British started to establish here, then it was more the Creek, or up here we know the Wally. They had mostly disappeared by the time the English colonies were set up because of disease. So the few were left joined into other native indigenous groups. So we had both the French and the Spanish on Cumberland Island setting up forts and doing their Christianity, trying to convert the native peoples there. Both of those two groups tried different times, set up missions, obviously were not successful in Cumberland. They were more successful, at least the Spanish were, further south, until the British came. And so James Oglethorpe settled the colony of Savannah in 1733. And while he was there, he gained the help of the chief Tamachichi, and then he came down all of the British Isles, and the islands here, and set up forts again on Cumberland Island. And so that is where we have the first English name of the island, which was first Highlands, because it was a larger island with bigger bluffs. Before that, the Spanish called it San Pedro, and it was also known as Miso. I'm probably not saying that right. That was an indigenous name for the island as well. So there have been many names, but the first British name was Highlands. However, it wasn't that for very long, because here's Chief Tamachichi and his nephew, Tunahowie. They traveled and were guides. They actually went back to Great Britain with James Oglethorpe, and through all of the relationships there, the story goes that Tunahowie met the Duke or the King's son and formed some sort of friendship. He got a cold pocket watch. So when he returned to Cumberland, he decided to rename the island. So what do you think the prince was the Duke of? Cumberland Island, yes. So that's where that term comes from. There are Cumberlands all over this country, all relate back to the land and titles of over there. This comes in handy again when we get to another name. So we go through the period of time. There was James Oglethorpe set up some forts there, kind of lost over times. The next major landowner, because that's where we're going to talk about history now, is the major landowners, was Caddy Green Miller. She married, her first husband was Nathaniel Green. He was a Revolutionary War general. They were originally from New England. She was actually from Rhode Island. And he was right under George Washington during that time. And because we were a new nation, he was given land as reward after the war was over and we became a country. He was given a plantation north of Savannah called Mulberry Grove. And so they moved down here. He did not do very well in the heat, Nathaniel Green. Unfortunately, he died of a sunstroke within a year of living in Savannah. There's a trend here coming up, by the way. So Caddy and her family had established there, but they looked at Cumberland as a source of income because at that point, Cumberland was full of live oak trees. And live oak trees, as residents of the coast, you know that during this time, they were harvested for their wood to make boats, especially naval ships. Because of the strength of their wood, instead of bending wood as what was traditionally done before that, we were now finding the branches that would be used to be the right angle, making them stronger. The ships were then nicknamed Old Ironsides because they were so strong cannonballs would bounce off of them. You might have heard this. The U.S. Constitution, which is still in the U.S. Navy, which is normally up at Boston Harbor, is an example of Old Ironside. Every island on the coast claims that the U.S. Constitution is made from wood from their island. It could be true. Cumberland is no different. They claim that it's them, but everywhere I have taught and learned claims it. So take it as you will. So they looked for a source of land there. So that was the first thing. Caddy had some money issues, so eventually they sold Mulberry Grove and moved to Cumberland Island since they owned land. They built, at the time, the tallest tabby structure. So it was a 4-story tabby house, and this is in 1803. So construction of it. Also, we know that tabby lasts if it's made correctly, and so those of you who are not familiar with tabby, it is a building material which is made from oysters, sand, water, and then burnt oyster shells we called lime. And every early plantation owner had a different percentage of it all to make it. But when it was built, it was like concrete. You have to do it in layers, and then it would be covered in stucco. And that stucco would seal in that tabby and make it last. So luckily, there's still some ruins of tabby structures. There's some full ones still on St. Simon's that you can see, but when it's done right, Jekyll has the Horton House. And this tabby is perfect. None of the wood's left, but the tabby is perfect to give you a good example if you want to visit an example of that. So they moved here. So Caddy did get remarried. She had brought in a tutor. His name was Phineas Miller. He was the tutor for about 10 years, and then they got married. He was way younger than her, so go Caddy. So they moved, so Phineas and her built this house. Phineas was also very into plants, and so they had some immense gardens that were built out here, and he tried different sorts of plants, olive groves and citrus out there. Fortunately, about a year after that, all finished, he gets tetanus from probably getting stuck by a thorn or something in his gardens. So he passes away. See the theme here? Men don't buy land in Cumberland. So that passed away. She did live out here for the rest of her life. All of that. Her house, though, this is a picture taken much later because the Civil War happened. The island was pretty much deserted at that time. This picture was taken later. It did become quite in the early 1900s, quite a vacation touristy spot to go see the ruins of Caddy Miller. So Caddy was just one of the few plantation owners that were on Cumberland. So after all that wood was used for ships, the island was completely changed because of the planting of cotton on the island. So Robert Stafford was more on the north end of the island. He was the largest plantation owner on Sapelo. And because of that, we forget that now today when we look at our islands, but majority of the islands on the Georgia coast, because of the plantations and the slave labor, were completely cleared. And the hydrology was changed in order to make it better for that. So we look at these islands today and think of them pristine, but really, they've been clear cut, and we're seeing the second growth of these forests. So we can't talk about nature on our coast without talking about the humans that were here before us and how they affected it. So he owned over 400 enslaved people on the island, and he grew long staple cotton, which is now known as Sea Island cotton. And just like on our other barrier islands, it was longer, it was finer, and they could get a higher price for it, because it was used to make linens and laces. It was a higher quality crop. So when the Civil War happened, the island was basically deserted with the Union troops coming down. Obviously, Caddy had long passed. Actually, Robert Stafford was passed. So the island had gone through a lot of different hands until we get to the Gilded Age, or the age of the northern industrialists coming to our coast looking for a winter retreat. So this was the same here on on Cumberland. So in this case, you had the Carnegie family. So this is Thomas Carnegie and Lucy. Thomas was the younger brother of Andrew Carnegie. So Thomas kind of was brought along. Andrew was the older brother, and Thomas kind of just worked with him, amassing these huge amounts of wealth up in Pittsburgh in Standard Oil and then in steel production. But because of that, Pittsburgh, just like many of our northern cities at that time, air pollution was atrocious in the winter. Also, just like me, we like to move south to escape our winters. And so Lucy fell in love with Cumberland Island when they were visiting it, and it was because of this. It had a notoriety. She knew this house was here, and so it helped why she wanted to buy Cumberland. So their first initial plot was only 4,000 acres. But by the time she died, she owned 90% of the island, and the island is over 36,000 acres. So over her time, she did a lot of property. This is actually her second home on the island, and it's in the same spot. So she actually raised or knocked down Caddy's house and built her house in that same spot. It's actually higher on a bluff. It's in a good location. Again, this is the time where they were looking for access to the deep water. That's how they got in and out. They weren't building houses on the beaches. They were building it on the river, the marsh side, where it was more protected. Because again, they were there in the winter, and they were also doing a lot of hunting. So it wasn't like today's culture where we want to sit on the beach. So she moved here. She had 9 children. Guess what happened to poor Thomas a year after the house was complete? He died of pneumonia. Lucy had fallen so much in love with Cumberland. Instead of this just being a winter house where they're only here for 6 weeks a year, she wanted to be her primary residence. So she completely redid the home. So the original home was much smaller. So this is the second rendition. So it's much more in the Spanish styles. It had 50 rooms. Now I can't remember if it was 12 or 14 chimneys, but give or take. Again, naturalist teaching history. Sometimes my numbers leave me. And she also had all of the amenities that she could have for her students. So she had a tutor for her sons. She had governesses for her daughters. She built a 9-hole golf course. She built an indoor heated swimming pool that also had a billiard room and a squash court. They were also avid hunters, so the islands were stocked. That's really what brought a lot of the people down here. So they had all of that hunting. They had horses not for riding for hunting, but also playing polo. They had a polo field out there. I'm sure I'm forgetting. They had every sort of boat thing you could possibly have. They had every cars out there that they could. So living, obviously, no expense was spared. This is the Gilded Age. If you're watching that show on HBO, it's fabulous, but to give you an idea of what it was like to live at this time. She did not ever remarry. They still were not here all year. So when I say primary residence, this is still the time that they would have gone north in the summer. They still weren't spending their summers here, but they would have been here fall, winter, spring. But then they would have gone to do the season up in Lake George or Providence Newport, not Providence. Newport, Rhode Island. But the one thing about having all those children on a very quiet island is that you don't want them to leave you. So as the children aged, she also built additional homes on the island for her married children. So that's why we have all of these other homes that are on the island. Probably the biggest spectacular or the best example this is Plum Orchard. This is in the middle of the island. This is actually part of the national park system. And it have daily tours that you can go through it, and does still have some of the original stuff in it. This is Stafford House. So when she bought land, she bought the old Robert Stafford home and his land. That house burnt down. So this is still called Stafford, but it's a home that Lucy built. This one's still in private, and we'll talk more about that in a second. This is Grayfield Inn, this is the one that's still private. This is the bed and breakfast that anyone can stay in. It's beautiful. This was originally built she hired a tutor for her sons. He moved up. He became the estate manager. When he got married, he got a house. And so this is the Grange. This one's still standing as well. The Grange, though, did get remodeled when it was given to her daughter, Floss, because again, it was not grand enough for her daughter as it was for her office manager. Yes, or her estate manager. And then this is the cottage. Unfortunately, the cottage has burnt down, but it was in proximity to the main house, which I forgot to tell you the name of. The main house is Dungeness. It was the same name that Caddy used, and it was also this name that we believe that James Oglethorpe used for his hunting, or his abode that he had on Cumberland. Does anyone have an idea where that name came from? The crab is named for the same thing. The Duke of Cumberland, when you get a title, you also normally get a piece of property. So the property is Dungeness. So it's an historical name. So there's no dungeons in the house. And the crab is also named for that as well. So these are the homes of the Carnegies. I did not center this picture. The other notable historic place, so all of those homes are on historical registries now because of the time and the importance. The other registry is what is now the Ice House Museum. So they used to ship down blocks of ice from the Great Lakes and store them. These are really thick walls with it. It's now used by the Park Service as a little museum that's in there. But this is only used for a certain amount of time because as technology evolved, Dungeness had electricity. St. Mary's did not have electricity, so they could see this house aglow. And then they also had ice making abilities out there, so they had to stop shipping their ice. So the Gilded Age is the age where if you served a cold meal, you were showing your wealth. Because anybody, even the poorest person, could serve a hot meal. But only the super wealthy could cook a meal and cool it and serve it. So this is the age of aspics. And cold turkeys and cold hams at lunchtime. And ice cream, or the start of the ice cream and the ice drinks and that stuff. So makes you think of food a whole different way. Lucy died in the early 1900s. Again, she had 9 children. Her main house ended up being basically closed up because at that point all the other kids had their own places and they had taken most of the stuff out of the home and moved away. However, as the generations went on, we also had stock market crash. The wealth wasn't always there. Her kids also weren't encouraged to have jobs. So there was that. So over time, some of the Carnegies were doing fine. Other Carnegies' descendants weren't. So there started to be fractions selling off. And then in the 60s, a developer came in and bought up a swatch of land. That developer was Charles Fraser. He is famous for developing Hilton Head Island. And so when that happened is when all of a sudden there was this advocacy effort, this big upwelling of people in support to not let what happened there happen on Cumberland. So between the Georgia Nature Conservancy, thank you, and private donations and the Millen Foundation, they were able to buy up and then donate a lot of the land and so helped protect it. So in 1972, Cumberland becomes a national seashore. But there is a whole book you can read about this land acquisitions. I mean, it was a lot of work in order to get this purchase for all citizens of it. And then in 1982, you have the center of the island, which is made into a wildlife preserve. Yes. So the center of the island. So that puts even more protections on Cumberland from development and roads and all of that. But when this is all happening, not everybody sold to the Park Service. So and this is kind of the story in a lot of national parks. We don't realize that there are still private landowners within the national park. And so those can go a bunch of different ways and how it happens. So some of the descendants sold outright and just said, there's my land, I want my money, fine. Some of them, in the case of Stafford and the Grange, they did historical leases. And every historical lease looked different. It meant we are selling you our land, but this has to happen before it goes to the Park Service. So the Grange was a set number of years. So in 2010, the Grange turned over to the Park Service. Stafford is these many people had to pass away. And so that's in that case. So, and then that piece of property will turn over to the Park Service. In the case of Grayfield, they were just, no, thank you. We're going to keep it. And then the 10% of land that Lucy didn't own was the very north end of it. There were some settlements up there, and that most of that land did not turn over either. They just kept it as well. And there are some stretches of land actually not too far from the campgrounds. There's some others that are also in private property that did not sell. So there are still some pockets out there. You can spend hours talking about that. Dungeness, though, was part of the original property because that's what Dungeness looked like when the Park Service came in. So in the 1950s, there was a fire that devastated the Dungeness mansion. And because of that, it now has these amazing photos that you can take and see of the land. But because of obviously we started in a national park, there's not enough funds to do things. And at this point, the cost to rebuild that in the original style, especially getting on a barrier island, as we all know, is astronomical. So the only thing the Park Service has done to the ruins is that every couple of years they go in and pull the vines that start growing on it. And then you can kind of see it in this picture, see these black I-beams. Those were put in the mid 20-teens just to help stabilize what's there. Because now you can see that Dungeness was made out of tabby as well. It was mostly tabby, Georgia brick, and then it was covered in stone. But you can actually see again how that tabby that's in here. This view is the opposite of the earlier view I was showing you because this house didn't have a front and the back as we have today. It had the carriage side and the great lawn side because entertaining, again, was done all around. It was all, again, Gilded Age, always for beautiful. So the horse in the room or the elephant in the room, Cumberland is known for having horses all over the island. Historically, there would have been horses in the 1700s that were originally brought over with the Spanish and the French. But by the 1800s, those would all have been rounded up and sold off. So when you hear the debate if these are wild or if they're feral, we know for a fact because of a DNA study done by the University of Georgia in the 1990s that these horses are not those stock. They are not like the Assateague or Chincoteague ponies. These are much more recent. There's a lot of legends about how the horses got there. For years, even I was taught that it said it in Lucy's will. When she died, she wanted her horses released. Her will was released about 15 years ago. There's no word of that in there. However, she probably said that she wanted her horses released. And so these are all descendants of the Carnegie family horses that are now on the island. So they are considered feral. There's a lot of news about them over the last couple of years. There is every couple of years. Because they're feral, the federal government can't do anything with them except remove them. So think of feral cats or nutria rats in Louisiana. They're seen as a nuisance. They're a non-native species out there. There's not really good food for them. So unfortunately, Park Service really, all they do is count them. So there's about 140 to 150 depending on the year. They do a census about every year out there. Currently, the lawsuit is actually about removing them because of the lack of nutrition and proper food sources out there. But for most people who visit there, one of the top reasons that people go out there is to see the horses. So it's been a give or take over many years. So we'll see. This is still might change in our lifetime. Other historic notes out there. I told you there. So after the Civil War, a lot of the formerly enslaved or the freedmen came back onto the island and created the settlement of these families that lived and worked off the land. Later on in the 1800s, there were actually hotels built up there that no longer exist, and a lot of them worked up there as well. But they also built the first African-American Baptist church up there. It's not very large. It's a one room. It was also used as their schoolhouse. It was used for all of their meetings. But it became the most famous first African-American Baptist church when John F. K. Jr. and Bassett married in the 90s? I don't even remember anymore. The 90s. This was obviously before social media. This is before cell phones. And they were able, because it's an island and their connections to the Ferguson family that owned Grayfield, they were able to buy out all the tickets and buy out Grayfield so they could have a paparazzi-free wedding in this tiny little church on the island. And I am glad everyone in this room is older than me, because this fact goes over everyone under the me's head anymore. Because too much time has passed. So we're going to transition now and talk a little bit more about the habitats that are out there on the island. And so this, I know, is a very simple picture, but I love it. I use it all the time for teaching because it is a cross-section of an island. So you start on the beach, and if you walk straight across it or east to west, you are going to, in an undeveloped island, you are going to hit all of these different ecosystems. Our barrier islands have so many different niche ecosystems to talk about. So it's too long for my slides. So you go this way, and then you have to come back here and go all the way out until you end up in the salt marsh. So we're going to start in the salt marsh. Also, you might have noticed there are some photo credits here. A couple years ago, we were invited to work with the Glen Visual Arts Association. So these were photos that were used by artists there. So that's why there's some really spectacular photographs mixed in with my photographs within here. And so we're all familiar with our salt marshes and how productive they are. They help with erosion, they help with water control when flooding times happen. They're also our filtration systems. All of our rivers, freshwater rivers, flow through our marshes and go through this filtration system before entering into our oceans. And these are the winners, or the powerhouse of that cycle. Our oysters are taking out not only the food they want from the water as it flows through, but they're also holding onto toxins and filtering that out. And so they, in the growing season, can filter between 40 and 50 gallons of water a day. Talking about a 4-inch oyster. So vitally important for the health of our ecosystems. And then the Spartina grass is also holding on to a lot of that water, becomes a sponge. So in flood times, it holds on to that fresh water. In times of drought, it can re-release that water into the system. So super dynamic, productive ecosystem on our coast. On Cumberland, you also have these pocket marshes, or these more uplands. So we think of just Spartina grass in our marshes. That's our low marshes that are going to be inundated with more water. But you also have these higher marshes that you'll have a more diversity of plants. You'll get more black needle rushes. You'll get sea oxeye daisy. You'll just get a different diversity, which is equally important in the diversity of things that are out there. We are getting to the time that these creatures invade our marshes. These are horseshoe crabs. They are an ancient species. They're all sync up with the moon cycle, and so in May, all of them congregate together to lay their eggs. They lay very tiny mustard seed sized eggs that are green. And so they time this together. The female is in the front, and then she'll have all of these males tacked on behind her and fight for the right to fertilize her eggs. Well, them doing this causes all of these shorebirds that are flying from South America up to the Arctic to breed. They time their migration with the production of those horseshoe crab eggs in order for them to fill up here on our Georgia coast in order to make it all the way to the Arctic. So in this case, you've got ruddy turnstones, you have red knots. They're all coming here, and we're very lucky because this is the time of year. These guys are already showing up. They're getting here trying to fill up, waiting for those, because the horseshoe crabs has kind of started, but May is the really big time where they're laying millions of eggs. So tons of these birds are coming here, and Cumberland, because of its size, has an incredible amount of shorebirds that are coming through just to feast on the abundance of food in these marshes. There are actually over 300 species of birds that can be found on Cumberland Island. So these are just a few. How can you not throw in a spoonbill? So spoonbills are also the more iconic, beautiful, wanting to see species that we find in our marshes. They get their color from the food they eat, like flamingos. But, so that's why they're pink. And because their babies, when they're born, are gray. So now we're going to transition into the maritime forest, which I love personally. So that is dominated by our live oak trees, which get their name because they keep their leaves all year round, even though they are a deciduous evergreen. So evergreen, go back to school, means they keep their green all year. Deciduous means they drop their leaves. So it's one of those. But as we know, they just dropped all of their extra leaves as they push out their new ones. So they do drop throughout the year. So, and then their understory are these sawtooth palmettos. And then red bays are the other big understory, which you're seeing popping in here, are the understory of this. This set of trees is actually where the campgrounds are at Sea Camp. This was an area that was clear cut at a certain time. So all of these trees are about the same age. They're also trees that are closer to the ocean. So there's one major plant that we think about in the maritime forest that's missing from these trees. Does anyone know what's missing from this picture? Some resurrection, there is a little there, but you're on the right track. Okay. Yes, I heard it, moss. So our Spanish moss is missing because these are very close to the sand dunes this picture was taken, and so they don't like salt spray. So Spanish moss loves this humid, wet air we have here on our coast, but hates salt spray. So pay attention now when you're on the edges, not so much on the marsh because you don't have the constant wind blowing, but the live oak trees that are right on the edge of sand dunes, notice that they are missing their Spanish moss. Whereas my next picture is a more dense, fully formed things where we start to get, actually there's not that much in here, too much Spanish moss in here too, but these beautiful wild areas. So these areas, so besides being the prettiest and just lovely to be in, also provide food for obviously animals. They provide protection. Again, you're now escaping from the wind and the rain in here from storm events. Also, this is where we can get a lot more freshwater ponds that are formed. So Cumberland has enough artesian wells that come up, so there are freshwater ponds all year, unlike a lot of our other islands that only have freshwater seasonally with rain. So that allows for a lot of different mammal species and reptile species. So I believe it's over 30 types of mammals are found on Cumberland Island, and over 50 species of reptile and amphibian can be found on Cumberland. So for example, obviously my pictures, turkeys and armadillos, but there are obviously the horses, there are deer, raccoon, squirrels. There are some bobcats out there on the island, so that would be our top predator for now. There used to be other things. There would have been bear and panther out there at some point in history out on these islands. So this is a habitat we don't normally talk about, and this is also a habitat that has had a lot of rain in it in this picture. These are our interdune meadows. So when you transition from your forest before you get to your primary dunes and your beach, there would have been layers of sand dunes, and then lower areas were almost become these thicket, scrubby areas. A lot of this habitat has been lost on our coast because of development. This is exactly where people want to build their homes, close to the beach, a little protected back. So these areas often get developed first on barrier islands. And you lose this. So on Cumberland, there are areas where the interdune meadow is over a mile in width, where in most of our barrier islands on the coast are not a mile wide in the whole thing. So we do have some larger areas of these zones here, which are super important, again, for birds and resting during flights. And again, you get seasonal pools here called sloughs that a lot of frogs actually like seasonal ponds that dry up more, less predators in the water for them. So important for our amphibian populations to find shelter. And then you start to get to your primary dune system, which is a whole nother habitat that different types of animals use. This is railroad vine that's in bloom, very similar to morning glory, just a different color that's out here. You also, this is the zone where you get your Sea oats. And sea oats are vitally important to keeping those first layer of dunes in. These plants can have 6-foot roots out and down. So they're holding on to that primary dune, that protective layer in them. And then obviously as the summer goes in the fall, they get those beautiful oat seeds on them that spread in the wind and help spread them out. But also this vine does the same thing. So in those warmer months, when we don't have hurricanes, where the calmer weather, they establish and also hold in those primary dune systems. And in those dune systems, you don't think about it, but it becomes a primary habitat in the fall for migrating butterflies. We always think about birds, but we don't think about the millions of butterflies that migrate through our coast in the fall. And that is the number one. And I know somebody, I was like, you count them every year out on Little St. Simons, but Gulf literaries are coming through here in the thousands every year. So they're a little bit smaller than that's bigger than it is in real life. They are smaller and often get confused of monarchs, but they're much smaller. They also don't have the white and the black outlines that a true monarch will have. Monarchs also fly through this inner dune meadow. Seaside goldenrod is one of them, and then the shepherd's needle, which not very many are done, which blooms in the fall and October. You see it all along the roadsides around here too. Most people think it's a weed, but it is a fantastic pollinator plant. It gets annoying because if you walk through it, you get seeds all up and down your pants. And then obviously you get into your intertidal zone on the beach, which is where you're getting, there are thousands of invertebrates that live under that sand. So in that intertidal, so on Cumberland, you have over 20 miles of this intertidal zone that is full of things we don't see. But again, birds and other crabs are actually probing in there and eating all of that different things that are living within that. And obviously, this is obviously a group I was teaching out there, but you can see how far you can't even imagine walking to this long and not a single building in your sight. Ooh, that was not good. Just some other wildlife photos we have caught out there. These were swallows that just, again, huge numbers resting on the beach as they were migrating through. Unfortunately, the video I tried to put up here, Susan Inman, our coworker, and I were out there. She took this photo. But just a bunch of that, because typically we only really think of my next species laying their eggs in the sand dunes, but we also have plovers and oyster catchers. Oh, I'm gonna skip that one. Oyster catchers that nest in that right above the high tide line. So in the summer, when you're on these if you're lucky enough to go to these undeveloped beaches, it's really important to actually stay below the high tide line, because these eggs are so well camouflaged. They don't build nests like we think of songbirds and trees. They actually just lay in a little divot on the sand. And so oyster catchers and then Wilson's plovers, which are like this big, and their eggs are like this big, you won't even see them. So if you are lucky enough to go to deserted beaches in the summer especially, try to stay behind so we don't hit any of them. And you can see most of these are banded here on our coastline. That was just a pretty sunset picture. We'll go back and enjoy it for a second. And then obviously what we think about as our nesting animals are our loggerhead sea turtles, or sea turtles in general. 90% of the sea turtles that lay on Georgia beaches are our loggerhead sea turtle. And so these are just an example of some of the nesting numbers over the last couple of years. And you can see that we doubled 2 years ago. So sea turtles don't lay every year. They can, but they average about 2 to 3 to 4 years. 3 is the most common. Obviously, if you're laying that many eggs, you need to take a couple years off. So we tend to have these peaks that every third year tends to be a really high number. Obviously, that varies on that. We are currently have hit one recovery point, but we're kind of stagnating because it takes 35 years for about 35 years for a female loggerhead turtle to become old enough to lay eggs again. So we're doing okay, but we have another plateau until we hopefully get back to recovery numbers. Lose them, but they have 25. in July that are out there every morning looking for those nests. They have the busiest summer out there and less help than other islands. So yeah, so hopefully that gave you a little bit more knowledge and appreciation for our largest burial island here in Georgia, and hopefully you learned a little bit more. Were there any questions online?
I actually just had a question, but I put it online.
Oh.
My question was just with the communities, the freedmen communities that were on Cumberland, what happened to them? Like, were they bought out or removed, or?
Over time, similar stories on a lot of our islands, lack of jobs. Obviously, there's no causeway over to Cumberland. So, and especially once those hotels shut down and the Carnegies weren't out there in the same numbers, because their biggest employers were the Carnegies and these hotels. So as the hotels shut down and as the Carnegies moved off the islands and stuff, there was a lot of lost opportunities. Yeah. Good question. Well, thank you all for joining us online. If you have any more questions, please ask them, and thank you for joining us.